Yeah, order. You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man.
Well, everybody seems to agree there do have to be boots on the ground to complement any bombing if there is to be bombing, and there has to be some viable post-IS political plan. The Prime Minister says we can't wait for the politics to fall into place, we must take action now, but he agrees bombing won't work alone. But as we've said, the conflict is complicated, countries more and less friendly to us are involved, united in hating IS, but implacably opposed on the issue of Assad or on the Kurds, or on Sunni-Shia tensions. Well, Mark Urban is here, our diplomatic editor, to explain some of what it would take to beat IS. Mark, what kind of military forces are bearing in on this conflict?
Well, key, obviously, is those people on the ground. And right from the start of this campaign, 16 months or so ago, the situation has been different in Iraq to Syria. All sorts of foreign help going in there. You've got the Kurds, for example, with help from Britain, Germany, all sorts of people. Recently made some good gains against IS in Sinjar. You've got Iranian-backed militias in Baiji. And then down here in Ramadi, you've got the actual Iraqi army with big help from the Americans, for example, doing this. Very recently, just a couple of days ago, a bridge into Ramadi, cutting it off to isolate IS in Ramadi. So some progress there. But if you look into Syria, you've just got a small American-backed force in that far northeast corner of Syria. The rest of Syria, if you want troops on the ground, it's got to be either Assad's army or one of those rebel groups. Now, David Cameron today talked about 70,000 so-called moderate rebels. Experts wouldn't actually wildly disagree on the number of non-jihadists under arms, but it's not a cohesive bloc. It's dozens of non-jihadist groups with politics from the fundamentalist to the democratic to the Christian, other ethnic groups, all sorts of people. If you had foreign forces in Syria, they could do things like seal off the border with Turkey, but nobody is prepared to commit troops in any strength, and without foreign forces on the ground, pressure will be limited. And of course, with all those different rebel groups, if ISIS did implode, they could soon be fighting over the spoils.
You've given us plenty of grounds for pessimism about it all. Are there any grounds for optimism over the military operation out here?
Well, interestingly, as they affect financial equation, recently there has been some important development on the question of the revenue IS gets from oil. You see the oil fields and the basic refining complexes here, and the trade basically goes on along this sort of access to Syrian government-held areas, but also to Turkey through middlemen. Now, Russia has recently upped airstrikes against the tankers that ply these routes, little self-drive tanker trucks. And in recent days, the Americans have joined in, ramping up theirs, strafing this line of tankers. So many destroyed, they said on this mission they ran out of ammunition. And they've actually got a rather sort of odd competition going now, a sort of virtue contest over who can destroy more IS tankers. The key thing there is, though, that will impact IS's income, but will they just turn the screw more on the local people and, of course, ask foreign donors for more?
Right. What is the key, then? What are the keys to moving forward?
Well, obviously, it's in the really broad geopolitical context. And, you know, you could go for a sort of internationally negotiated deal leading to a UN resolution, international peacekeeping forces. You might call that the Bosnian model. That's what was done after the Dayton Agreement 20 years ago. Obviously, that's very unlikely at this particular moment. The other key thing that's missing regionally is consensus among those key regional players. And of course, this week we've seen a sharp escalation of tension between Turkey and Russia. And just today, Russia has publicised the fact that they've brought very powerful anti-aircraft missiles into their base in Syria. Basically, a sabre rattle towards Erdogan in Turkey, saying, we will shoot down your planes if you try this again. That's how serious the tension is now between two key regional players. And frankly, although there's been some talk recently through the so-called Vienna process of diplomatic progress, unless you can get these key players, Assad backed by Russia, the rebel groups backed by the Gulf states, Turkey, unless you can get them closer together, you know, there really isn't going to be a meaningful change in the situation. Russia, we know, says it's hitting IS, but so many of the strikes have been against those so-called moderates that Mr. Cameron was talking about today. And frankly, unless you can crack that central conundrum of Assad and the rebel groups, people will carry on supporting IS, and everything America does, and by extension Britain, will be peripheral to that central question.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. Well, in the Commons today, the intervention of one man was important. We heard this earlier. He's Crispin Blunt, chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. His committee had written a report sceptical of military action, but Mr. Blunt now says his reservations have been dealt with. He's in support, and he's here with us. Very good evening to you. It sounds like a morass. You were sceptical because you said there had to be some kind of provisional political arrangement to provide boots on the ground, to provide something to fill the gap if you get rid of ISIL. What
changed?
What satisfied you? You've got all of that in place.
Vienna has changed this. If you look at the conclusions of the Vienna meeting on the 14th of November, you can see the route to a transition process. And the significance of Vienna is that you've got all the key countries around the table, the Iranians and the Saudis, a process led by the Americans and the Russians. And the key elements of that agreement outline the future type of state that Syria will be. It outlines the political process, the electoral process that will happen at the end of it, ensuring that Syrians who've been displaced from Syria are going to be part of the electorate. It outlines who's going to be supervising that process. And then critically amongst that, it commits the countries around the table, all who have different clients in this game, to actually bring their clients to the table. And you can see the need for that for the Russians. They need an out, given what's happening with Turkey.
I hear what you're saying. Why? The key thing the Prime Minister is saying, because he agrees you've got to have all of this in place, his key proposition is we can't wait for that to be delivered. We have to shoot now, bomb now, and fill all of that in later.
And what we know is that the British contribution to airstrikes in Syria is going to be marginal to all of this. The containment and the degrading of ISIL within Syria is happening at the hands of the French, the Americans and the Russians.
But why wouldn't we wait? Why wouldn't we just wait and see whether the politics fits into place?
The question for the United Kingdom is whether it can be more influential on the politics as a full member of the coalition or as a non-belligerent in Syria.
So that's the hypothesis. If we're in the coalition, full part, we will have more influence over that political process.
That's one of the questions, and I would agree that's a marginal call. I would, having spoken to the Saudis, for example, and the Emiratis in the course of the visit my committee's made in the last week, they are very keen that we should be in that coalition. And there's certainly an element at which our European and American allies kind of looking at us, if you're not fully in this, we're not really going to listen to what you've got to say. And there is also the issue of solidarity, particularly with the French in the light of Paris. Now, our leaders feel that quite strongly. And since this is such a marginal call, then my view is the House of Commons should give them the benefit of the doubt, because the reason is at the bottom of this, ISIL has got to be defeated.
Right, but
that's the bottom line.
What happens if the judgment that you're making, that the Vienna will lead to something sensible, what happens if that doesn't happen? You've just got another great morass where we're just bombing people and there's a lot of enemies fighting around them.
Well, I think there are a lot of quite fundamental reasons now why the Vienna process is going to produce something. The principal reason is that the Russians have now got themselves engaged, and they now need an out. Otherwise, they're going to be left in this.
But there must be a risk that Vienna doesn't lead anywhere. That's the risk of bombing first and then waiting to see whether it delivers, as opposed to doing it the other way around.
Well, the bombing is happening anyway. So the British role in the bombing is at the margins. There is a little bit of military utility that the government are claiming, which exists. If it's made too much of, it's an argument carrying too much weight. But there is some weight in that argument about the use of the particular skills of the RAF and Brimstone missile and the intelligence acquisition kit they've got as part of the coalition. But the principal issue here is about how can Britain be taken most seriously as a member of the coalition or half a member of the coalition.
Just one last one. We heard today of the 70,000 non-jihadi fighters, Free Syrian Army fighters. Could you name the leader of that group of fighters? Who do we phone if we want to talk to them?
Well, it's President Kaja, who is the current president of the Syrian National Coalition. That's the political body.
So if one of them is breaking the Geneva Convention, or we hear about some of them behaving atrociously, we call him and say, can you deal with that?
Well, there is a process going to go on next week as the Saudis are holding a meeting of all the Syrian opposition groups to try and create a representative body for all the Syrian opposition groups to then enter these talks with the Syrian government. That is actually another important part of the process. It shows that the political transition process is now active. There is a plan, and you can see a route to it because everybody's interests are in getting this done. And if I can see the route to it, and the Prime Minister can see the route to it, and he took an enormous amount of trouble to answer my committee's questions clearly, then my judgment is now that we need to give him the benefit of the doubt, because there still remains the bottom line. We've got to take control of that territory off ISIL.
We're going to discuss with some people with local views, if you like, whether they agree that, that politics can be settled. Kristen Blunt, thank you.